restaurant usually throws out the shells, but now some restaurants are donating them to help save the oceans.
Oyster reefs are one of the most endangered marine habitats we have on the planet. We're going to use these shells and actually create new reefs and new habitats for oysters to land on.
China tried something that sounded careless at first. They took massive piles of oyster shells, leftovers from the seafood industry, and buried them in land considered finished. Slowly, soil structure shifted. Nutrients returned. Plants followed. When the results became clear, the story flipped from waste disposal to a global case study in how patience and simple materials can rebuild broken land on a massive national scale. China's ancient obsession with shellfish. For thousands of years, oysters have quietly shaped life along China's coast. Long before modern industry, coastal communities harvested oysters not only for food, but for something just as valuable. Their shells, rich in calcium carbonate, were burned into lime and used to strengthen farmland, seal walls, and stabilize early construction. Archaeological records and historical texts show oyster lime appearing in Chinese building practices as far back as imperial dynasties, when mineral resources inland were harder to reach. In southeastern China, the relationship went even further. In Fujian province, especially in places like Sunpu village near Quanzhou, oyster shells became part of everyday architecture. Homes were built with walls embedded with shells, chosen for their resistance to humidity, salt air, and erosion. People's Daily later documented that some of these shell houses survived centuries of typhoons and coastal flooding, outlasting newer concrete structures around them. What no one planned for was scale. Generation after generation, oyster farming expanded along China's coastline. Each harvest left behind mountains of shells. Over time, these discarded shells formed something rare in nature. A massive biogenic limestone reserve created entirely by human activity. It sat in plain sight, often dumped in open fields, shorelines, or unused land, treated as waste rather than material. By the late 20th century, this balance began to break. Industrial growth accelerated oyster consumption, aquaculture intensified, and shell waste piled up faster than communities could manage it. Coastal ecosystems suffered, while inland farms struggled with depleted acidic soils. The same material that once supported construction and agriculture was now seen as a problem. That contradiction sparked a question no one had asked before. What if the shells were never the waste at all, but the missing piece waiting to be used again? Fields left to die by acidic soil. By the late 20th century, the crisis moved inland. Across southern China, especially in provinces like Fujian, Jiangxi, Guangdong, and Hunan, farmland that once supported dense harvests began to fail. The problem was not drought or pests, it was chemistry. Decades of intensive farming relied heavily on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, particularly ammonium-based compounds. According to long-term field studies, repeated use of these fertilizers steadily pushed soil pH downward, creating widespread acidification in red soil drylands and rice paddies. Red soils already form under warm, wet climates and are naturally low in buffering capacity. When fertilizer inputs increased after the 1970s, the decline accelerated. Soil pH in some regions dropped below 5.5, a threshold where crops struggled to absorb essential nutrients like phosphorus, calcium, and magnesium. Yields followed the chemistry. Rice, peanuts, and rapeseed showed stunted growth, weaker root systems, and lower grain filling rates. As soils became more acidic, heavy metals locked safely in mineral layers began to move. Cadmium was the most serious. Research documented showed that low pH conditions increased cadmium solubility, allowing it to enter plant roots and accumulate in edible grains. In contaminated paddies, cadmium levels in rice exceeded China's national food safety limit of 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. Farmers saw the effects before scientists published the numbers. Crops yellowed early. Harvests shrank season after season. Some plots stopped producing altogether. In parts of southern China, land that had been cultivated for generations was abandoned, labeled as degraded or functionally dead. Traditional responses followed familiar paths. Agricultural lime was applied to neutralize acidity. Chemical soil conditioners were added to stabilize yields. These methods worked briefly, but rain and continued fertilizer use quickly erased the gains. Costs rose while results faded. By the early 2000s, the scale of the problem was undeniable. Millions of hectares of farmland showed declining productivity, and cadmium contamination became a national food security concern. They needed a solution that could raise soil pH, reduce heavy metal mobility, and last longer than a single growing season. That search pushed scientists to reconsider materials already abundant in China. Not mined, not synthesized, sitting in piles along the coast. The same shells that once built walls and villages were about to re-enter the story, this time beneath the soil. From waste to resource. Between 2014 and 2018, soil scientists in southern China began asking a practical question. Could oyster shells do more than sit in piles along the coast? Research teams working on acidic farmland started grinding discarded shells into fine powder and applying them to degraded fields. What followed was documented clearly in peer-reviewed studies published in Nature and related journals. The chemistry made sense immediately. Oyster shells are composed mainly of calcium carbonate, the same compound found in agricultural lime. When introduced into acidic soils, calcium carbonate reacts with excess hydrogen ions, raising soil pH. But field data showed this was not just a short correction. In long-term trials on red soil drylands and rice paddies, repeated oyster shell applications steadily lifted pH levels and kept them stable across multiple growing seasons. Application rates were carefully controlled. Researchers tested between 750 and 2,250 kilograms per hectare, spread annually. Over time, treated plots began to diverge sharply from untreated land. Rice plants developed stronger root systems and better nutrient uptake. After 5 consecutive years, yields in some test fields exceeded control plots by more than 10%. A significant gain in regions where production had been stagnating. The most critical result went beyond yield. Acidic soils had been mobilizing cadmium, allowing it to enter rice grains at dangerous levels. Studies published in Nature showed that oyster shell amendments reduced cadmium bioavailability by raising soil pH and increasing calcium competition at the root level. In treated fields, cadmium concentrations in harvested rice dropped closer to, and in some cases below, China's national food safety threshold of 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. Soil structure changed as well. The shell powder improved aggregation, reduced compaction, and encouraged microbial activity essential for nutrient cycling. Unlike synthetic conditioners, the effect persisted, even under continued fertilizer use. Farmers noticed fewer signs of nutrient stress and more consistent growth across planting seasons. What made the findings impossible to ignore was consistency. These results appeared across multiple provinces, soil types, and crop cycles. The solution was not imported, patented, or expensive. It was already available in massive quantities. Waste from coastal aquaculture had outperformed conventional amendments in some of the most damaged soils in the country. By the time these results circulated beyond academic journals, the implication was clear. Oyster shells were no longer just a disposal problem. They were a soil restoration tool with a measurable impact. Buried tons of oyster shells. In coastal areas like Dongshan County and Zhengzhou City, discarded shells had piled up for years, sometimes reaching several meters high. According to partnerships registered under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals platform, local NGOs, agricultural scientists, and county governments decided to tackle both problems at once. Oyster shells that once clogged shorelines were collected from aquaculture zones, seafood markets, and processing centers. Fishermen and oyster farmers were paid to sort and deliver shells instead of dumping them. Volunteers joined cleanup drives along tidal flats. The shells were then washed to remove organic residue, sun-dried, and mechanically crushed into usable material. What had been a disposal cost turned into a raw input. Researchers from local agricultural institutes coordinated where the shells went next. Degraded farmland inland, especially acidic plots that had lost productivity, was mapped and prioritized. According to SDG project records, this effort linked coastal waste zones with hundreds, and in some pilot areas thousands of hectares of struggling farmland. The logistics alone marked a breakthrough. Coastal communities and inland farmers were suddenly part of the same system. Field trials scaled quickly. Instead of small research plots, entire fields received shell amendments at rates based on earlier scientific studies. The work was labor-intensive. Shell powder had to be spread evenly and incorporated into the soil before planting season. Farmers who had abandoned certain plots were encouraged to return, often skeptical but willing to try after years of failed fixes. What made Fujian different was follow-through. These were not one-season demonstrations. The shell treatments were applied consistently over multiple years, monitored by soil testing and yield tracking. Local agricultural bureaus recorded changes in pH, nutrient balance, and crop performance. Shell reuse also reduced pressure on coastal dumping sites, easing shoreline erosion and water quality issues. The program changed how waste was viewed at a provincial level. Oyster shells were no longer classified only as refuse. They became registered agricultural inputs in pilot zones. Processing yards appeared near ports, creating new jobs tied directly to environmental cleanup and land repair. According to project summaries, this closed-loop approach reduced shell accumulation while restoring land once written off as exhausted. By the end of the experimental phase, doubt had faded. Everyone knew oyster shells could change soil chemistry. Now the real test awaited. Would barren fields actually respond? Once the shells were buried and mixed in, the land would show what years of research had promised. Transformation begins. The real proof arrived with the first planting seasons. Once the crushed oyster shells were mixed into the soil, changes began that farmers could see without lab reports. Fields that had tested as highly acidic started to stabilize. Soil pH rose into a range where crops could actually function again. Research summarized on ResearchGate documented that rice and peanut plots previously marked as low productivity responded within 1 to 2 seasons, showing stronger early growth and improved root development. What mattered most was consistency. Unlike quick lime treatments that faded after heavy rain, oyster shell material continued reacting in the soil. Calcium carbonate dissolved slowly, maintaining neutral conditions across planting cycles. As pH stabilized, nutrient lockup eased. Phosphorus became available again. Calcium and magnesium returned to the root zone. Plants stopped showing early yellowing, a common symptom of acidic stress. MDPI studies tracking these trials recorded another shift beneath the surface. Soil organic matter increased alongside the pH correction. This was not accidental. Healthier crops produced more root biomass and residue, feeding soil microbes that had been suppressed by acidity. Microbial activity rose, improving nitrogen cycling and soil structure. Compacted plots began to loosen, allowing water infiltration instead of runoff. Farmers noticed the difference immediately. Rice tillers thickened. Peanut plants filled out instead of stalling halfway through the season. Yields did not just improve, they became predictable again. In regions where harvests had fluctuated wildly, consistency returned. For many farmers, that stability mattered more than peak numbers. Perhaps the most striking change was human. Land that had been written off began to draw people back. Farmers who had shifted to off-farm work returned to test one field, then another. Abandoned plots were cleared and replanted. Local agricultural offices recorded rising cultivation rates in areas previously classified as degraded. The transformation was not dramatic in a single moment. It unfolded season by season. Each harvest reinforced the decision to keep going. Each soil test confirmed that improvement was holding. The shell-treated fields did not just recover. They began outperforming neighboring untreated land under the same climate and fertilizer conditions. What made this phase different from past interventions was depth. The soil itself was changing, not just the surface chemistry. Microbial networks re-established. Nutrient cycles resumed. Crops interacted with the soil instead of fighting it. By the time these fields reached their third and fourth seasons, the results were no longer limited to food production. The soil had regained function as a living system, and once that system came back online, it started doing more than growing crops. That was when researchers began measuring effects that went far beyond yield, freezing toxic metals where they sit. As the fields recovered, scientists began paying closer attention to what was no longer visible. Beyond healthier crops, the soil itself was changing in a way that addressed one of China's most serious agricultural risks: heavy metal contamination. Studies published in Nature followed oyster shell-treated fields over multiple growing seasons and found a clear pattern. As soil pH increased, the mobility of toxic metals dropped, especially cadmium. Cadmium had been a persistent problem in southern China's rice systems, largely due to industrial emissions and long-term fertilizer use. In acidic conditions, cadmium becomes soluble and easily absorbed by plant roots. Oyster shell amendments altered that pathway. By raising pH and releasing calcium ions, the shells reduced cadmium availability in the soil solution. Calcium competed directly with cadmium at the root surface, limiting how much entered the plant. Field data showed measurable results. In treated plots, cadmium concentrations in rice grains declined significantly compared to untreated controls. Some studies reported reductions approaching 30 to 50% after repeated applications. These findings mattered because China's national food safety limit for cadmium in rice is 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. In areas where crops had exceeded that threshold, oyster shell treatment pushed levels back toward compliance. Long-term trials published through Springer Nature added another dimension. Researchers compared oyster shells with conventional agricultural lime across several years. Lime raised pH quickly, but the effect weakened over time, especially under heavy rainfall and continued fertilizer use. Oyster shells behaved differently. Their slower dissolution provided a sustained buffering effect, keeping pH stable across seasons. That stability was key for long-term metal control. Environmental risk assessments showed broader benefits. Cadmium binding increased in soil particles rather than remaining in water-soluble form. That reduced leaching into groundwater and limited accumulation in the food chain. These outcomes positioned oyster shells as more than a yield enhancer. They became a remediation tool for contaminated land. As these results spread, agricultural agencies began considering oyster shells in land reclamation strategies across China's main farming regions. Polluted paddies that had been restricted from food production were reevaluated. Shell-based amendments offered a lower cost option compared to soil removal or chemical stabilization. While attention focused inland, another story unfolded along the coast. Oysters were already known for filtering water and improving marine conditions. Now, the same material that cleaned fields was gaining recognition for its environmental role at sea. The link between land and coast was becoming clearer. Oyster shells were not solving one problem in isolation. They were connecting pollution control, food safety, and ecosystem repair into a single approach. And that raised a new question. If oysters could clean soil and crops, what else had they been doing quietly in the water all along? The coast's built-in defense system. Long before oyster shells were mixed into farmland, their most visible work happened at sea. Along China's northern and southern coasts, oyster reefs once formed dense natural structures made of living oysters cemented to generations of shells. According to reporting by the South China Morning Post, these reefs extended across hundreds of miles, especially in shallow coastal zones where nutrient-rich waters supported rapid growth. Each adult oyster filtered up to 50 liters of water per day, removing algae, excess nutrients, and suspended particles. That natural system began to fail during the 20th century. Industrial fishing expanded, coastal land reclamation accelerated, and untreated wastewater flowed into nearshore waters. Wikipedia data shows that in regions such as Bohai Bay and Laizhou Bay, oyster reef coverage declined by as much as 70 to 90%. The loss was not cosmetic. Without reefs, water clarity dropped, fish nurseries disappeared, and shorelines became more vulnerable to erosion. The consequences were measurable. Algal blooms increased as natural filtration collapsed. Sediment movement intensified without reef structures to slow currents. Coastal biodiversity declined as oysters, crabs, and juvenile fish lost habitat. By the early 2000s, scientists and conservation groups began treating reef loss as a water quality crisis, not just a fisheries issue. Restoration efforts followed a practical path. In Hong Kong, the Nature Conservancy partnered with local universities and communities to rebuild reefs using recycled oyster shells. According to project reports, shells collected from restaurants were cleaned and placed into mesh structures, then deployed in shallow waters. These structures acted as settlement surfaces for oyster larvae. The results were tracked closely. Within months, new oysters attached and began filtering water. Monitoring showed improved clarity and increased species presence around restored sites. Fish counts rose, and benthic organisms returned. The shells also absorbed wave energy, reducing shoreline erosion during storm events. These were not experimental tanks. They were working coastal systems. What stood out was familiarity. The same calcium carbonate material restoring water quality offshore was improving soil chemistry inland. In both cases, oyster shells created stable physical structure, moderated chemical extremes, and supported biological activity. Whether in water or soil, the process followed the same logic: build a foundation, restore balance, allow life to return. This realization connected two problems once viewed separately. Coastal waste and degraded farmland shared a solution. Oyster ecology showed that recovery depends on structure, chemistry, and time, not quick fixes. By understanding how reefs rebuilt themselves when given the right material, researchers gained confidence in applying the same thinking on land. The coast had already proven the concept. What worked underwater was now shaping how China approached recovery across its agricultural heartland. Scaling up. When early experiments showed oyster shells could revive farmland, government agencies took notice. China's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs rolled these shell-based soil improvement projects into its national land quality programs. Through the ministry's Arable Land Quality Monitoring and Protection Center, they launched pilots across 13 provinces over 3 years, targeting acidified fields. Crops included rice, garlic, potatoes, apples, ginger, and peanuts, covering both staple and specialty agriculture across very different regions. Private companies quickly became essential to scaling the work. One of the leading firms is Mata Eco, based in Xiamen, which specializes in oyster processing and soil restoration technologies. Founded in 2011, Mata runs 4 production centers and holds more than 120 patents related to oyster products and soil amendments. The company partners with research institutions such as the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences and takes part in national projects that set industry standards. In the pilot zones, government and private teams coordinated collection, processing, and application of the shell-based conditioners. In Fujian's Hui'an County, the first demonstration project covered 1,812.6 mu, roughly 121 hectares of degraded soil. They applied about 271.9 tons of oyster shell conditioner, raising soil pH from 5.11 to 6.05, increasing organic matter by more than 37%, and boosting lettuce yields by 20%. These programs also linked soil restoration to climate initiatives. In Hui'an, experts from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Fujian Carbon Neutrality Society created guidelines to calculate carbon sequestration from shell-treated soil. The first demonstration reduced 5,643 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, with savings traded through the Xiamen Property Rights Trading Center, generating revenue while advancing sustainability goals. Similar partnerships expanded to counties in Ningxia, Hunan, Jiangxi, and Guangdong, where oyster shell conditioners are now standard in restoring acidified and contaminated farmland. These programs are fully supported by policy, demonstration funds, expert guidance, and carbon markets. What was once coastal waste has become a strategic input. Oyster shells now improve soil health, increase agricultural productivity, and provide measurable carbon benefits. Coastal piles of discarded shells are no longer just a nuisance. They are transforming degraded farmland across China, connecting environmental cleanup, agriculture, and climate action in a single scalable approach. Shells that saved harvests. Farmers in Fujian, Jiangxi, and other regions began seeing results that went beyond soil tests and yield numbers. In Jiangxi province, long-term research showed that applying oyster shell-based soil conditioners over several years helped control soil acidification and supported peanut productivity in red dryland soils. This effect translated into real hope for rural households that had struggled with declining harvests for years. Farmers reported stronger crops, healthier root systems, and more robust nutrient uptake, reducing their reliance on expensive chemical fertilizers and pesticides. These practical changes helped restore farm income and confidence in land that had once been considered hard to manage. The economic impact spread to coastal zones as well. In Fujian, Coastal communities where oysters are a major aquaculture product saw huge volumes of shells, over 1.5 million tons produced annually, being processed instead of left to rot in piles along village roads and shorelines. Companies like Mata Eco in Xiamen built processing centers capable of handling 400,000 tons of shells each year, converting them into soil amendment products. This created jobs, from shell collection and processing to delivery and field application, bringing new income streams to fishing towns and reducing local environmental burdens from shell waste. Villages began to view discarded shells as a resource rather than a liability. In Fujian's Taining County, for example, 150 tons of oyster shell-based soil conditioner donated from coastal partners helped improve soil pH from about 5.11 to 6.05 in previously acidic rice fields. That soil improvement increased yields by around 13% compared to previous seasons, while providing more stable grain growth. Farmers said the land felt more fertile and easier to manage than it had in years. Reclaimed fields also became places to experiment with sustainable agriculture models that blended century-old marine harvesting traditions with modern eco-engineering approaches. These models emphasized local resource recycling, lower input costs, and improved environmental outcomes, something researchers and local leaders emphasized as critical to rural revitalization initiatives across China. As soil quality improved and coastal communities found new purpose in shell processing, the scale of impact began attracting attention in provincial capitals and urban policy circles. The idea that what had been seen as waste could restore land and livelihoods was gaining acceptance as a practical, scalable approach. That acceptance set the stage for broader national programs and growing interest in how oyster shells could transform land far beyond the fields and villages where the first results were already visible. The big reveal. What began as a solution to toxic soil gradually became something far greater. In China, fields once described as dead were being revived through the reuse of discarded oyster shells. Soil chemistry research shows that repeated application of oyster shell powder raised soil pH and reduced cadmium uptake in rice for more than 5 years of trials, directly addressing heavy metal risks that affect nearly 17% of China's agricultural soils and cadmium contamination in over 40% of those areas. After consistent treatment, rice yields rose while the amount of cadmium in grains declined. This confirmed that oyster shells could improve soil and crop safety in ways few expected. The effects rippled outward from fields into wider economic systems. In Fujian, organizations and local enterprises developed models turning shell reuse into viable industry. One example is a pilot at Hui'an that combined oyster farming, waste shell utilization, soil improvement, and carbon sequestration trading. Shell-based soil conditioners from this project generated more than 5,600 tons of carbon sequestration credits valued at 100,000 yuan, demonstrating that soil remediation could generate measurable environmental credits as well as income. Plans were underway to expand to cover larger areas, with expected additional carbon reductions valued in the millions of yuan. This was not a local curiosity. Scientists outside China studying similar approaches documented that oyster shells and seafood shell biochars can reduce cadmium uptake in crops and improve soil fertility indicators like phosphorus availability and enzyme activity. These studies point to the potential for shell-based amendments as low-cost, accessible tools for farmland recovery around the world. At the same time, projects operating in China framed this work within global environmental priorities. Coastal technology firms introduced concepts that connected soil health with climate outcomes. For instance, some reclaimed fields were described as capturing over 2 tons of carbon dioxide per unit area each year simply through the combined effect of shell amendments and increased plant growth, turning farmland into functioning carbon sinks. Farmers in these systems began participating in carbon trading programs, receiving feedback payments for verifiable carbon sequestration tied to healthier soil. International interest followed. Researchers and land managers in other countries facing degraded farmland and heavy metal contamination began citing China's field results and cost-effective shell reuse approaches in academic literature and policy discussions. The idea that a byproduct of seafood could rehabilitate soil was drawing attention from policymakers and rural development specialists focused on sustainable food systems. Ultimately, oyster shells moved from waste piles to central elements of practical land restoration. They improved soil quality, mitigated pollution, supported rural economies, and even contributed to carbon management. In doing so, they helped reshape the narrative about how degraded landscapes can be brought back into productivity and ecological function. From discarded material to a tool for soil transformation, China's oyster shell strategy has offered a model for sustainable land use in a world where healthy soil is becoming ever more valuable. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.